You're listening to the Two Tongues Podcast. And now your hosts, Kyle and Chris.
Welcome back, one and all, to another episode of the Two Tongues Podcast. Today, we're going to do a little bit of opinion scholarship. This time around, on a philosopher, a thinker, a Frenchman, whose name I'll probably mispronounce, Teilhard de Chardin. Chardin, I don't know. But if you've heard of him, perhaps you know. I'm going to speak today about a book that he wrote called The Phenomenon of Man, because it's right up my alley, which you guys will see momentarily. Trying not to say you guys, failing off the get here. In any case, I wanted to talk maybe just a little bio before we jump into the material. It's very, very fascinating, and I plan on doing a follow-up conversation with our man Brian Cranley, author of called Wonder. Let me pull this up here while we're talking. Let's do this. All right, so you guys can see the wiki here. This is the gentleman we're going to be talking about today, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. What you'll notice, just scrolling through here, is there. First of all, he was a Catholic priest. I didn't actually know that the whole time I was reading the book. Born in the late 1800s, died 1955. So a French Jesuit Catholic priest, but primarily a scientist, paleontologist. They also call him a philosopher, which is going to make a lot of sense when we talk about what we're going to talk about today. And they also call him a mystic. Again, that's going to sound right up my alley, and you'll see that. But beyond that, I want you to know he was famous for all sorts of things. He was a world traveler. He was heavily involved in evolutionary theory. He was involved in some of the archaeological work that was done, some of the earliest archaeological work that was done on humans' ancestors. So one of the earliest fossil finds was at the time called Peking Man. He was involved with the research there near Beijing. You'll notice that he's criticized for being pseudoscientific, and that's really where all the good stuff is that we're going to talk about today. In fact, I really kind of peeled away all of the dry academic stuff and focused on all of the good stuff, which again, I think these people are calling pseudoscientific. I'll let you be the judge of that. But he fought in World War I. You can see, I won't get into the full bio, but you get the idea. This gives you some gist of the gentleman we're going to be talking about today. So without further ado, let's get into it. All right, so I want to begin kind of in the preface in the early part of the book when he talks about what the book is going to be about, and I'll just give you maybe just one line from it. He says, "This work may be summed up as an attempt to see what conclusions are forced upon us when man is placed within the framework of phenomena. I doubt whether there is a more decisive moment for a thinking being than when he discovers that a universal will to live is harmonized in him." The hair stands up on my arms. A universal will to live is harmonized in him. Like there's this pre-existing spirit of life that exists in the cosmos. And at some point in its evolutionary progress, it becomes embodied in a human being and harmonized in him, okay? So we're going to see a lot of these allusions to incarnation. And I guess in retrospect now, it's no surprise because he was a Catholic priest why that might be the case. But so much of what he says, and he was actually criticized by the Catholic Church, by the way, for his doctrinal statements, for his positions on Christian doctrine. And I think all of these allusions to incarnation are the reason for this. And I actually agree with him on these points. So it's hard for me to agree with the Catholic Church's perspective on this. I don't want to put the cart before the horse, so I'll kind of allow this to kind of come up naturally rather than telling you what I mean right away. But when he says that he wants to look at man in the framework of phenomena, what he means is from a scientific perspective. He means to step outside of being a human and observe what humanity is and what a human being is as a phenomenon. In the same way you might do with a new sea creature that we discovered that we've never seen before. We want to observe it as a fact, right? It's a thing that is, but we want to seek to explain that fact. And so that's what he's doing here. He's putting man in the perspective as a fact and seeking to understand or explain that fact. I'm going to jump right into the mysticism bit. I have no choice because he does this right off the bat when he starts to talk about the nature of reality, the cosmos, the origins of the cosmos. Because what he does in this book is he starts from the beginning of time, and he works his way all the way up to the phenomenon of man, which he sees as the, you might say the pinnacle of, but really he's more specific than that. He's like, this is the most advanced thing that evolution has developed to date. It's not to say we're the end all be all. We're not the culmination. There's something beyond us. So maybe we were, Australopithecus, and then we became, Homo habilis, and then we became, Homo erectus, and then we became Neanderthals or whatever, and now we're a fully modern Homo sapiens. There's a process of development in a Darwinian sense, and we are not the end of it. It's something that's going to continue to go. But when he starts at the beginning and tells this whole story, it gets mystical right away, and I love it. I love it. So let's get into it. I call this first section "Universe as Ouroboros, One in Many." Now, if you listened to this podcast before, in particular my opinion scholarship episodes, you'll know this mythological symbol of the Ouroboros. This goes back to ancient Egypt, and it's something that we see all over the place in world religions, and mysticism as a symbol is something that I am fascinated by. This is often depicted as a serpent swallowing its tail. This is, I've said many times, a symbol that represents the union of opposites, and it also represents something which is self-created. So you can understand why this is an idea that's associated with God. So a universe as Ouroboros. Okay, here we go. He says, matter reveals itself as radically particulate, yet essentially related. Plurality and unity, like the tiny diatom shell whose markings, however magnified, change almost indefinitely into new patterns. Bewildering in its multiplicity, the substratum of the tangible universe is in an unending state of disintegration as it goes downward. All right, so I want you to see the Ouroboros in this. I mean, it's quite plain when he says plurality and unity. He's talking about the union of opposites there. Like, what does it mean when you bring opposites together? It creates some sort of cognitive dissonance, which is key to mysticism. So he's talking about the universe. He's talking about matter, what makes the universe up, as being somehow paradoxically plurality, many, and unity, one. The universe is one thing. It's made up of all these particles, all these atoms, whatever it might be. And then he makes this allusion to a diatom shell, where when you magnify, the further you magnify the image of the shell, the patterns in the shell continue to change. This is like a kaleidoscopic type of an image, but it really is describing something that's fractal. So if you guys have seen the Mandelbrot set or any of these interesting fractal patterns, geometric patterns, you know what I mean. This is something that's it's a pattern that's self-similar. So it means, the further you zoom in on it, it's just going to continue to produce more and more versions of itself. And then there's diversification involved with the Mandelbrot set in particular. All kinds of new shapes form as you go further and further into the fractal. But he's saying something about this that's associated with matter in the universe itself. He's saying that the universe is fractal. And this helps you to understand this plurality and unity idea, this one and many idea, because a fractal, like the Mandelbrot said, is one thing. It's produced by a single mathematical formula. It's one reality, and yet within it, it contains all of this endless multiplicity. There is literally no end to the patterns that are generated in the Mandelbrot set in a fractal. And I'm not speculating here when I say that it's associated with a universe. This is what scientists tell you. You look around the cosmos and you see examples of fractal geometry everywhere. I go to the gym most days. I do this thing where I just found this new machine where you can hang upside down from your ankles and kind of like decompress your spine. So I've been trying that out. And when I do that, I'm like upside down, staring out the window of the gym, staring at the sky from upside down. It's kind of beautiful. And I can see the trees. And right now it's winter. There's no leaves on the trees. So it almost looks like the trees themselves are hanging upside down. That's what it looks like. And I can see all of the patterns of branches. And this is a fractal image, like the tree. It grows from one stem. That stem branches out into multiple others and multiple others and multiple others. And you can zoom in at the large scale or at the small scale. And every bit of this branching pattern, it's going to resemble itself, even though there are new directions and sizes and so forth. It's almost hard, maybe impossible, without perspective to tell, am I looking at the whole tree or just a part of the tree or what have you? And this is what I mean. You see the same pattern in the way broccoli grows, the way that the blood vessels in our bodies are, a lightning strike. I could go on and on. The patterns like this are fractal in nature everywhere. It seems like it's without doubt a part of the fabric of reality. And Chardin is pointing that out. He goes on, he says, on the other hand, the more we pulverize matter, the more insistently it proclaims its fundamental unity. It is reducible in the end to some simple substance. We find the atoms can only be defined by virtue of its influence on all around it. They're not independent of each other. Something holds them together. Right, so it's one thing to talk about the bewildering multiplicity of the world and how it's fractal and you could zoom in forever, that kind of thing. But then to step back and say, and yet it's all one thing. It's all made up of the same simple substance, whether we call that subatomic particles or electromagnetic waves or whatever you might want to call it. It's all made from the same thing and represents a united whole. So it's multiplicity, but it's also unity. It's that Ouroboros paradox. And he makes this statement when he's talking about atoms. He's like, scientifically speaking, and he's talking about pulverizing matter. And so you have to understand the time he was living, this was like the beginnings of particle accelerators and things like that. Right after the Manhattan Project is basically, he dies 10 years later or whatever. So we find, he says, we find atoms can only be defined by virtue of their influence on all around it, right? That they only exist as a distinct thing in association with the whole. And then he goes on to say, they're not independent of each other. Something holds them together. And I want to put my finger on that something. What is that something that holds them together? He's describing they're mutually counterdependent. Okay, so he goes on, he says, each element of the cosmos is positively woven from all the others, from beneath itself by composition, and from above through unities of a higher order which incorporate it. It is impossible to cut into this network, to isolate a portion. This perpetual opposition between the one born of the many and the many constantly being born of the one runs right through evolution. All right, so a couple things here. I love this opening bit where he says, each element of the cosmos is positively woven from all the others. And he describes that. He says, from beneath itself by composition, right? So my body is made up of all sorts of cells in some sort of unity. And you can go down even further, of course, and you can go down to the chemical structure, the DNA, you can go down to the atomic structure and the subatomic structure. So every level of me is built from something smaller. That's composition, right? I'm a oneness composed of all this manyness, bewildering multiplicity, he says. Then he says, but also from above, through unities of a higher order, which incorporate it. So what does that mean? Well, you might say that I'm part of a family, right? So I belong to a greater unity than just my individual being. I belong to a greater family. You might also say that I belong to a sort of ecosystem of the earth. I'm like, a part of the ecosystem of the earth or the cosmos in the same way that a cell or an atom is a part of me. And so you have this Russian nesting doll fractal image here. This is very Whiteheadian. Remember when we did those episodes on Alfred North Whitehead? This is right up that same alley. We're all a bunch of Russian nesting dolls. The unity the oneness that contains them all. But you can keep popping the tops off and going lower and lower and lower. So you have, the composition and then these higher unities. So going up and going down. He also says that it's impossible to cut into this network to isolate a portion. And this was kind of part of the biggest pushback on modern science. Like, we're going to get into the resistance to accepted evolutionary theory because Chardin has his own ideas, which are interesting, and we're going to focus on that a lot. But where he pushes back on accepted science primarily is this idea that science believes that they can examine the world in itself. They can examine phenomena in themselves as if they can separate themselves from the cosmos and look at the world objectively or look at a phenomenon objectively. And just like he said with the atoms a moment ago, there's no way to separate that. Like, I am part of the cosmos that I am exploring and observing and examining. So if I'm a scientist, it's impossible for me to remove myself from this process of science that I imagine is some objective thing that it's not. So this is really key here, because remember, this guy lived right around the time of the quantum revolution, where people were talking about how significant consciousness is in the observer effect and fundamental physics. And he's like, look, we can't remove consciousness from the cosmos. It's part of the cosmos. And so this is an obstacle, he says, to scientists who think you can. All right, he says, we must never lose sight of the unity of the biosphere that lies beyond the plurality of individual beings. A unity of origin, framework, and dispersed impetus. And that dispersed impetus part is interesting and important. It's going to come up again. What he means by dispersed impetus is, I think of impetus as a will, almost like a will. And he sees this cosmic beginnings of bewildering diversity, like he's talking about. You might imagine the Big Bang explosion and all of the chaos and all of the little particles and all of the energy spread out eternally and constantly expanding. This is dispersed. Something has been dispersed, and it's a multiplicity. But remember, a multiplicity is also a unity. So what is dispersed has to in some way be one or come back together, and we'll get there. But dispersed among this, fundamental primordial soup is impetus. There's some sort of will involved. And this is at the heart of his evolutionary model. And it's at the heart of where he veers from scientific orthodoxy. So let's get in. I'm going to call this next section the missing within. He says, in its early stage, science imagined that we could observe phenomena as they would have taken place in our absence. They are now beginning to realize that even the most objective of their observations are steeped in the forms of thought, so that when they reach the end of their analysis, they cannot tell whether the structure they have reached is the essence of the matter or the reflection of their own thought. Whew. Hair stands up on my arms. See, this is the point I was trying to say a moment ago, maybe less eloquently. You cannot separate the observer from the observation, right? And this is that Ouroboros paradox again. The observer and the observation are one. How is that possible? He says, I believe in science, but up to now, has science ever troubled to look at the world other than from without? Coextensive with their without, there is a within to things. The time has come to realize that an interpretation of the universe remains unsatisfying unless it covers the interior as well as the exterior of things, mind as well as matter, right? Because they're one. You can't just suppose we're gonna talk strictly about matter when, to Chardin's mind and to my own, matter is imbued by this thing we call mind. You can't leave it out, or you're going to have a incomplete, or he says unsatisfying theory. And I think that's what we have today, an unsatisfying theory of physics. Quantum physics has stalled because, in my opinion and many other people's opinion, because physicists do not take into consideration mind. To them, it's an epiphenomenon. It's an accident. It's a byproduct of deterministic operations. It's nothing. And as long as they think it's nothing, we're never going to progress in our science. This is what Chardin believed. The within he's talking about, this is the consciousness bit, the mind bit. He says, with man, the existence of a within can no longer be evaded because it is the object of a direct intuition and the substance of all knowledge. It is impossible to deny that deep within ourselves, an interior appears, right? It's like the one thing I can know for certain, if I go back to Descartes, I think, therefore I am. There's one thing that I can know for certain is that I have an interior, I have a within, I have a mind. I am. I have a consciousness. I am. That's the one thing I cannot doubt. And this is all Chardin is saying. He says, in one degree or another, this interior should obtrude itself as existing everywhere in nature from all time. Consciousness necessarily has an omnipresent value by reason of the fundamental unity of the world. Consciousness reveals itself as a cosmic property, subject to transformation. All right, now that last bit, you start to see how evolution's creeping into the picture. He's saying that consciousness is a cosmic property, and as such, it's subject to transformation in the same way that matter is subject to transformation, in the same way we see organisms being subject to that evolutionary transformation. But the larger point he's making here is that he says, like, look, in one degree or another, this interior we're talking about, this mind part, this consciousness part of reality, should exist everywhere in nature from all of time. It's not something that's generated or created at some point. It must always have been there. Why? He says, because consciousness necessarily has an omnipresent value by reason of the fundamental unity of the world, right? The cosmos is one thing. So if something exists in the cosmos, like the consciousness we observe in ourselves, then it must exist in the cosmos. It must be there. It must have always been there from the beginning. And this is an allusion to what he said earlier about dispersed impetus, like consciousness being dispersed among all of the particles and energy of the cosmos from the very beginning. Even if you say it was there only in potential, whatever that might mean, it must have been there from the beginning. It must be what he calls a cosmic property, a property of the cosmos. And as like any property of the cosmos, it's subject to transformation. That brings me to the next section. I'm going to call this one Within and Without Evolve as One. Within and without evolve as one. Okay, here we go. He says, atomicity is a common property of the within and the without of things. The elements of consciousness, exactly as the elements of matter, differentiate their nature little by little. A richer and better organized structure will correspond to the more developed consciousness. So listen to what he's saying here. He's saying, just like matter is made of atoms and they become more organized and complicated and transform over time, consciousness is exactly the same, and it's subject to exactly the same rules, laws, processes. He says the within of things has this atomicity. It has this quality that we attribute to matter and never seem to attribute to mind. He's like, no, there's a richer and better organized structure as it's created materially that will always correspond to a more developed consciousness. Now, science will argue that that's because of the consciousness being a byproduct of the operation of the brain. So the more sophisticated the brain gets, the more sophisticated the consciousness gets. Chardin is breaking from that. He's saying, no, it would be something more like consciousness has a reality, and it's only able to be expressed as well as the nervous system is developed. So the more complex the nervous system becomes, the better you can express this thing, this conscious component, this within of the universe, if that makes sense. This is the way he looks at it differently than, modern evolutionists. He says, the universe is thought of as passing from state A characterized by a large number of simple material elements, that is to say, a very poor within, to state B, defined by a smaller number of very complex groupings, that is to say, a much richer within. Right? So as things develop, as they come together, they become more sophisticated. We see that kind of in the evolutionary process. And he's saying in step with that development, you have a more sophisticated mind, a more sophisticated expression of consciousness. That's possible. He says spiritual energy, and by this he means psychic energy. He says spiritual energy increases in step with the increasing chemical complexity of the elements of which it represents the inner lining. Right? Consciousness is the inner lining of the matter, so of material elements. He says, in the cell, the stuff of the universe has reached a higher rung of complexity, and by the same stroke, advanced further in interiority and consciousness. So when there's a time in the cosmos where the most sophisticated thing are these chemical compounds, let's say, they still have a mind, but it's very simple. Their material structure is disorganized, so consciousness can't express itself very well in that way. But through the transformations that we call evolution, those chemicals then become a cell, a living cell. And once you reach that change of state, as he'll call it, once you reach that next evolutionary rung on the ladder, then your material complexity goes up, and in step with that, your conscious complexity or expression of consciousness becomes more complex. And that brings me to the next section. I'm going to call this section Orthogenesis, the will of evolution. This is where Chardin really breaks from the scientific orthodoxy. If you've never heard of the word orthogenesis before, I don't blame you. I had to look it up. This book was filled with words that I had to look up. And I had to look them up multiple times, by the way. In any case, it was a vocabulary experience for me. It was a vocabulary enhancing experience. So what is orthogenesis? Just so you have some idea. Orthogenesis is, if you look it up, if you look up the wiki or something, it's going to tell you it's a discredited theory that evolution is not random, but follows a path towards a specific goal. Okay, and this is associated with Aristotelian philosophy, which emphasizes, if you remember, we spoke about this with Brian Cranley, teleology, telos. That's the Greek word for it, but it's the idea that nature is directed towards a goal or a purpose. And if you want to understand what that purpose is, you look and see what the thing does. What is the purpose of a human? Look and see what a human does. What is the purpose of the cosmos? Look and see what the cosmos does. This is going to help you see the direction of evolution, and according to Chardin. So you can understand, to say that evolution isn't random but has a direction. You remember I call this section the will of evolution. So even a step further, to say that evolution has a will, maybe that's even a stronger word than a direction. This is something that atheist scientists are going to reject, because atheist scientists have no way of explaining how in their opinion, random, deterministic biological process could be directed. If there is no God, if there is no reality that transcends physics, how could it have a direction? So obviously Chardin is a Christian, or is a Catholic, so to him this makes a lot of sense, but he's not basing his argument here in favor of orthogenesis on his Christian background, although it would be impossible to say it's not colored by it. He has all sorts of scientific reasons for thinking so. So let's get into it. He says, on the plane of animate particles, of living particles, we find the fundamental technique of groping. Groping combines the blind fantasy of large numbers with the precise orientation of a specific target. It would be a mistake to see it as mere chance. Groping is directed chance. It means pervading everything so as to try everything, and trying everything so as to find everything. So you can see again this sort of fractal picture that comes up. So what he means by groping is that nature is reaching out, trying to find those places where it can advance. He's talking about that example of, chemicals or atoms or whatever that eventually become a cell, right? There's all this trial and error that's going on, all this deterministic trial and error, right? And he admits that. He's like, this combines the blind fantasy of large numbers. This is the determinism aspect of trial and error, with the precise orientation of a specific target. Now, what he means by this is it's really obvious. It's like if the cosmos is just this random fluctuation of activity, and every now and then that activity causes something new to happen that allows things to progress in a new direction. This process of groping, this random process of groping, is actually designed to find those areas where where the process of evolution or the progress of the cosmos can continue. And this is what he says. This is not mere chance. It's directed chance, right? It's all this random stuff is trying to do something, right? It has a will. It's trying to do something. It's trying to progress. It's trying to push forward into some new niche. It's trying to expand itself somehow. And we can see that at the largest scale with the cosmos expanding continually. We can see that in this fractal way, everything growing and changing. And certainly we can see this in the process of evolution, from the phylum and the orders and the families of life. They branch out in the same fractal way, right? They're groping in the same way, trying to find a different survival niche, right? A different Darwinian finch, right? Everyone has a different shaped beak. They're out there they're literally changing their beaks randomly to allow themselves to live off of a different flower, right? They're groping and branching off and trying by trial and error to find the next path for life to continue, for this whole process that started with the Big Bang to continue. And what is this process? What is it doing? Chardin's point is it's doing something. We know it's doing something because it's not random when it begins with a Big Bang and has managed to go from, like critical amounts of chaos and entropy to a human being. It's clearly doing something. All right, moving on. He says, there exists in living organisms a selective mechanism for the play of consciousness, the nervous system. We find from layer to layer the nervous system continually developing and concentrating. It is only rarely that we find any branch of creature does not lead in time to more and more cerebralized forms. The nerve ganglions concentrate, they become localized and grow forward in the head. At the same time, instincts become more complex, and the phenomenon of socialization appears. Such coherence could not be the result of chance. The differentiation of nervous tissue provides a direction and therefore proves that evolution has a direction. Right? So you can step back and look at the archaeological record, and you can see the nervous system's becoming more and more complex and moving in a particular direction. And that direction is doing something very significant. It's continually enhancing how consciousness can express itself. It's giving us more and more capacity. It's diversifying mind, in a sense, in the same way it's diversifying, physical form that we acknowledge in evolutionary theory. He says, everywhere the phyletic lines grow warm with consciousness towards the summit, but where the most powerful brains ever made by nature are to be found, they become red hot. And right at the heart of that glow burns a point of incandescence. After thousands of years rising below the horizon, a flame bursts forth. Thought is born. Whew. Right? So this is the direction. That brings me to my next section. I'm going to call this section, this is a big one here, but cosmogenesis, geogenesis, biogenesis, psychogenesis, new genesis. And I know it's a mouthful, but I give that to you because this is the pattern that Chardin lays out for us to look at the grandest scope of evolution. Rather than just looking at evolution as it applies to living things, he's talking about if you step back far enough, what you see is evolution is not something that applies strictly to living things. The entire cosmos, from the birth of the cosmos, drives itself towards the birth of the earth, geogenesis, and the process of the transforming earth drives itself towards the point of what? Biogenesis, the birth of life. Life continues to develop into the next section state is reached of psychogenesis, where life has a mind, and then new genesis is a play on the Greek word nous, which means mind. But in a sense, this is almost like a disembodied mind. This is almost like mind that no longer needs a physical body, something like that, in the simplest form. So the birth of the cosmos leads to the birth of the earth, to the birth of life, to the birth of mind, to the birth of this new stage of whatever's coming next. So let's see what he has to say on it. He says, geogenesis is extended in biogenesis, which in the end will express itself in psychogenesis. We see life at the head with all physics subordinate to it. And at the heart of life, explaining its progression, the impetus of a rise of consciousness. The impetus of the world can only have its source in some inner principle, which alone could explain its advance towards higher psychisms. All right, so there's a mouthful there, but you can see what he's saying. He says, geogenesis, the creation of the earth, is extended into biogenesis. It's all a flow of one sort of process. He said, in the end, will express itself in psychogenesis, the birth of the mind. And he says, this is amazing as far as I'm concerned. He says, we see life at the head. By that, he means at the head of this process of geogenesis, of the earth being created. Life seems to be the goal here. He says, we see life at the head with all physics subordinate to it. So all the physical processes, all the reactions in the, all the physics stuff that's happening in the cosmos is driving towards the creation of life. And we know that because that's what it did. It created life. And then he said that at the heart of life, explaining its progression, is this impetus, this will towards consciousness, towards the rise of consciousness. And then he calls that the impetus of the world, which is, it's another way of saying the impetus of the cosmos, or the impetus of everything. The will of everything is to push towards this consciousness, the rise of consciousness. He calls that towards higher psychisms. That's the ability to express consciousness more fully, something like that. So there's something inherent in the cosmos that directs itself towards consciousness. See, that's what the cosmos does. When we ask the question, the telos of the cosmos, what does it do? We look for what it does. And he's saying clearly what the cosmos does, because it's what it has done, is created consciousness and made it more sophisticated, ever more sophisticated. All right, he says, the awakening of thought affects life itself and the state of the entire planet. Psychogenesis has led to man engendering the development of the mind. In one word, new genesis. All right, so you might wonder about this. He says the awakening of thought affects life itself and the state of the entire planet. And this reminds me of this seminar I went to when I was in college. I spoke to this guy. I'm trying to remember what he called it. He had some theory where he made a distinction between mankind in the past and mankind that exists as it exists today, in a kind of similar evolutionary way. And he called it like Homo domesticus or something like that, that we reached this point where our minds allow us to adapt to the world, so that our bodies no longer are required to adapt to the world. So the idea here would be that evolution no longer needs to change our physical being. Instead, it just needs to make it kind of becomes internalized. This is what Chardin will call involution compared to evolution, right? So the mind begins to evolve using the same processes in the same way as our physical bodies were subject to, because now we don't need to change our bodies to survive. We can adapt in other ways, in ways that involve the mind. And has that capability affected life? Has it affected the state of the entire planet? You betcha. He says, from Neolithic times onward, the influence of psychical factors begins to outweigh, and by far, somatic factors. And by that, he means bodily factors. So by the time we reach the Neolithic, clearly, it's the psyche that's driving the show, no longer the evolution of the physical body. And that has some implications, which brings me to my next section, which I'm going to call evolution beyond the body. All right, so Chardin starts to talk about the phylum, like the group of related creatures as a class or as a whole, okay? So you might see, it's difficult to do with humans because we're the only ones left, but you can imagine a time when, Homo sapiens existed, Denisovans existed, Neanderthals existed, the Homo floresiensis hobbit creatures existed. There was a time when all of those groups of Homo were existing at the same time. So imagine this whole class of beings as a phylum is what they call it. And he says this. He says, a phylum as a whole behaves like a living thing. In its own way, it grows and flourishes. The development of a phylum is strangely parallel to the successive stages undergone by an invention made of men. Roughly, the idea first takes shape, then follows a period of rapid modifications until it is completed. In just the same way, the naturalist sees the growth followed by the branches of life. All right, so you can imagine human beings invent the first bow and arrow, very simple single piece of wood sort of situation. And then we eventually come up with the compound bow, the crossbow. Like as we continue to progress and make it better, he's saying that the same way human beings refine and perfect ideas, the same process you observe there is happening in groups of creatures. They're becoming refined. And then by the time you get the compound bow, there's really no need for the longbow, right? So that those creatures die out. See what I'm saying? It's like this is the point he's making is that individual species, whole classes of species, and ideas are all seemingly subject to the same laws that we describe in evolution. It's beyond the body to whole groups and even to ideas. He goes on, he says, there is no sharp line between instinct and thought. There is not one instinct in nature, but a multitude, each corresponding to a particular solution of the problem of life. Instincts constitute a growing system. They form a fan-like structure in which the higher terms on each nerve depend on a better defined center of consciousness. Okay, so he's saying even instincts are evolving in the same way. Like you can map out instincts and see this same sort of fan-like structure you would see if you were outlining how each species developed from the next and the next and the next. They're defined, he says, by a better defined center of consciousness. So these instincts are changing in step with more sophisticated nervous systems or centers of consciousness. He says, from now onwards, it was not merely animated grains which the pressure of evolution pumped up the living stem, but grains of thought. Okay, so after the evolution of the nervous system gives rise to the birth of thought, then evolution takes a hold of thought in the same way it did previously with biology. He says, the ramifications of evolution reappear, and 1,000 social phenomena, which we should never have imagined to be so closely linked with biology, in the dissemination of languages, in the development of new industries, in the formulation and propagation of philosophic and religious doctrines, and each of these groups of human activity are a reproduction of the procedures of life. And each of these groups of human activity is a reproduction of this process of evolution that we observe driving life onwards, transforming it over the eons. He says, the instinctive gropings of the first cell link up with the learned gropings of our laboratories. The passing wave that we can feel was not formed in ourselves. It was set out at the same time as the light from the first stars and reached us after creating everything on the way. Man, oh man. Woo. So when he says, first of all, when he says the instinctive gropings of the first cell are exactly the same thing as the learned gropings of what we're doing in the laboratories, that just shows you again how he's seeing this process of evolution, even though we kind of think of what's happening in the laboratories as being some personal thing that's confined to our kind of individual isolated will. He's like, no, this is a continuation of something that's always happened. And that thing that's always happened is actually the thing that brought you here in the first place. It set out at the same time as this light from the first stars and created everything along the way to you. And you are now doing the same thing that it's done from the beginning of time. You are a continuation of what the cosmos has always done. And he says, the passing wave that we can feel was not formed in us. Whew, buddy. That brings me to the next section. I'm going to call this thought participates in evolution. All right, he says, thus we see not only as participating in evolution, but evolution as reducible to a progress towards thought. Man discovers that he is nothing else than evolution become conscious of itself. Oh, man. So I always say we are the experience God is having, and I can't help but think of this passage echoing that. Man discovers that he is nothing else than evolution become conscious of itself. The universe, the process of the universe, becoming aware that it is the process of the universe, something like that. And you have this image there, this image of feedback, right? The universe becoming aware of itself. It's almost like staring into a mirror. You get this feedback image, at least I do. And interestingly, it's exactly this feedback process that drives fractal geometry, like we were talking about before. Why is nature filled with fractals? Well, it's fundamental to nature somehow. And wherever we see fractals, it's associated with feedback. Even in the mathematics that produces something like the Mandelbrot set we talked about earlier, the solution to the equation gets fed back in as the starting place for the next calculation. So it feeds back on itself. That's how fractals work. And he's saying something much like this when he says man discovers that he is nothing else than evolution become conscious of itself. So not only does he see thought as participating in evolution, but evolution as reducible to a progress towards thought. He says, from the grains of thought, the universe goes on building itself in the inverse direction of matter. Okay, this is the involution idea that I was talking about. He says, evolution is henceforth occupied elsewhere, constructing with all minds joined together, mind. Okay, so there's an implication here that the development of mind, of all of the bewildering multiplicity, right, of all the manyness that gets developed, that there's some process of bringing that into unity, because the many is the one after all. It's the Ouroboros paradox. It can be no other way. So when mind is created, and many minds are created through the process of evolution, that they're also pushing towards something. And he says, constructing with all minds joined together, mind. And he means something different when he says mind the second time. All minds joined together are creating something new. He says, so far we have allowed our race to develop at random, and we have given too little thought to the question of what must replace the crude forces of natural selection. In the course of the coming centuries, it is indispensable that a nobly human form of eugenics should be discovered and developed. Is it not precisely the world itself, culminating in thought, which expects us to think out the instinctive impulses of nature so as to perfect them? Now, I wish I hadn't stuttered there, but lost some of its effect. But the point he's making here is, again, maybe a little, whenever you see that word eugenics in the modern age, I mean, it makes your eyebrows pop up a little bit. But he's saying if physics and this groping process he's talked about is to some degree deterministic and random, even though it's moving in a certain direction, he said, we don't really give thought into what must replace this process of natural selection. He says it's incumbent on human beings to discover a nobly human form of eugenics. So notice he's calling it nobly human. He wants to separate this idea from, Nazi ideas of race purity, that kind of thing. But there's something that we need to be doing if we're going to replace natural selection. And then he says, isn't it precisely the world itself that culminates in thought, which expects us to perfect this process of natural selection? Aren't we the pinnacle of the development of the cosmos? And isn't the thing that created us this process of evolution? And now that we have our thought, ingrained in this process, is it not incumbent on us to figure out how to move to the next step? Haven't we, hasn't the torch been passed in a sense from the deterministic mechanisms of physics now to the thinking, willful human being? Is there something we can do to help perfect this process, to continue to push evolution along? That's interesting, right? To participate in the process of evolution intentionally and willfully. It's a scary idea, right? I'm thinking about CRISPR and gene editing and all kinds of things. It's a scary idea, but it's scary because it's inevitable. And it's inevitable because it holds such great potential. Now he says, to create and fulfill the world is for God to unite it with himself by immersing himself in things and then assuming control of evolution to direct the general ascent of consciousness into which he inserted himself. All right, so I took this bit from the very last chapter. He waits till the very last chapter to say anything about God, at least directly, and he does so here. But the reason I put it here is because I want you to see when he says we need to figure out a new nobly human form of eugenics so we can move consciousness on to the next level. He's talking about human beings participating in the process, willfully participating in the process. And then he says something here very, very interesting. He says that willful process that exists in us, that only we are capable of now implementing, is an expression of something even greater. It's an expression of, he says, by immersing himself in things and assuming control of evolution, by God entering into, right? This is another one of those areas where he's talking about incarnation in a very subtle way, that God enters into creation to take control of evolution. And so that's what we are. That's what we represent to Chardin. We are the soul of God manifest in matter who can now take the reins of evolution and carry it onward. And that brings me to the next section. I'm going to call this one, The Beginning is the End. The force of evolution is its culmination. All right, so we have some more Ouroboros paradox here. The beginning is the end. How can that be? How can the force of evolution be the same thing that it culminates into? How can the beginning be the end? That sort of thing. He says this. He's speaking here about the future path of evolution, about what comes next. He says, an opening exists, that of the super soul above our souls. But in that case, the way must open out onto limitless psychic spaces. There is for us in the future, under some form or another, not only survival, but also super life. All right, now remember, he's talking about evolution, working on the without. After the birth of thought begins to become involution, working on the within, our consciousness. And so this is what he says, an opening exists, and that opening is a limit in limitless psychic spaces. So now we're talking about going inwards rather than going outwards. There's something new, something novel happening here. And whatever that is, he says, is not only a way for us to survive, like every state change in evolution is, this is a way for us to survive in a new way, what he calls super life. He says, we have seen that evolution is an ascent towards consciousness. Therefore, it should culminate forwards in some sort of supreme consciousness. And he has a name for this. He calls this supreme consciousness Omega. Again, this is a way for him. This is a way for him to use sort of scientific jargon, these Greek letters and words that you might see in mathematics, without coming right out and saying God, because Chardin does avoid that topic. He's so thoroughly scientific through the whole meat of the book, which is very dry in the middle for that reason. He's just showing you how much he understands and knows about the science, and never really directly broaching the subject of spirit or God or the supernatural. And so by the time he reaches this idea of Omega, like where evolution is going to move next, he doesn't call it God, although you'll see in a bit that's sort of what he means. He calls it Omega. And he says, while being the last term in its series, Omega is also outside all series. Not only does it crown, but it closes. The conscious pole of the world is not enough to say it emerges from the rise of consciousness. We must add that from this genesis, it has already emerged. In Omega, we have the principle needed to explain the persistent march of things towards greater consciousness. So, when he's talking about this, like consciousness must have been a part of the cosmos from the very beginning, even if it was in some sort of a potential way. It must have been there from the beginning, because the cosmos is a unity. Nothing comes in or out. It's all there. It's from the very beginning. And so this is the point he's making with Omega. He calls it the conscious pole of the world. That must have been in the cosmos from the beginning. And it's the thing that's providing the direction for evolution. He says, while being the last term of the series, he's talking about being this final step of evolution, maybe. He said it's also outside of the whole series. So you get this idea of a transcendent God who's also immanent in the world. Very, very Christian idea, but there it is. He says, not only does it crown, but it closes. Well, that sounds an awful lot like Alpha and Omega, if you get my drift. And he says it's not enough to say that it emerges from the rise of consciousness, right? It must have always been there from its genesis, he says. He says, new Genesis rises upwards in us and through us unceasingly. And when elements have sufficiently agglomerated, this convergent movement will attain such intensity that mankind will be obliged to shift its center onto the transcendent center of its increasing concentration. This will be the fulfillment of the spirit of the earth, the end of the world. The wholesale internal introversion upon itself of the noosphere, which has simultaneously reached the uttermost limit of its complexity and its centrality. Detaching the mind, fulfilled at last from its material matrix, so that it will henceforth rest on God Omega. Buddy, you see what I mean? So he's saying this new Genesis, this realm of consciousness, he's basically saying this is the culmination of evolution to date. He said that rises up in us unceasingly. And eventually, when the elements have sufficiently agglomerated, he's talking about all of these minds coming together. Remember, he said all the minds come together to create mind. This is this disembodied nous idea. All of the minds come together, the multiplicity comes back to the one. And he said, when this happens, mankind will shift its center of consciousness from each individual being to one concentration, the utmost centralizing consciousness, the oneness, the monad. And I wonder if this culmination is a phenomenon like the Big Bang was. What I mean is, these transformations are yet another fractal example of evolution in action, of phylogenesis, the branching off of something new, of consciousness penetrating into a brand new avenue of existence. Right? This is what the new Genesis is. It's a kind of a rebirth in a sense. And this is why he associates this with the end of the world. It's the end of this world. It's the end of this phylogenetic line. But the end is also the beginning, isn't it? So we're talking about the Ouroboros. The end is also the beginning, the Alpha and the Omega. And the consequence of this is this wholesale internal introversion is what he calls it. The noosphere joins together. This is something that happens on the within of things. And it allows consciousness to reach its maximum complexity, right? So consciousness can now express itself in the maximum way possible and its maximum centrality, because everything comes into oneness. What happens is mind can now detach from its material matrix and henceforth rest on God Omega. This is the idea of God creating the cosmos in order that the cosmos can give birth to God, right? And the self-created, this is the Ouroboros. This is the idea in a nutshell. God is the beginning and the end. The process of evolution is doing nothing but aiming at bringing into actuality this thing that existed in potentiality that started this whole process in the first place. Self-created. He says, by a perennial act of communion, he, and by he means God, Omega, aggregates to himself the total psychism of the earth. And when he has transformed everything, he will close in upon himself, thereby rejoining the divine focus he has never left. Then, as St. Paul tells us, God shall be in all. This is indeed a superior form of pantheism, the universe fulfilling itself in a synthesis of centers. God, the center of centers. Whew, buddy. And that brings me to my conclusion. All right, so despite a dense and dry middle, this book left quite an impression on me. Chardin goes through pains to reveal his empirical and scientific chops, in my opinion, because he wants to be taken seriously when he gets to the controversial and speculative bits of his evolutionary model. It's harder to dismiss a man who veers from scientific orthodoxy when he just demonstrated his mastery of the accepted science, right? And what really stood out, however, were the mystical threads he weaves into his model. When he describes the cosmos, a careful reader will detect over and again echoes of deep philosophic and religious ideas. The one and the many, the monad, the self-created, all these ideas describe the mythological Ouroboros, and yet Chardin applies them identically to the cosmos. Chardin observes a force driving evolution from the birth of the cosmos right up to the present moment. It permeates the material world from within. It has a direction, a telos, even a will. It is alive in a manner of speaking, and quite literally manifests life. The Big Bang does transform itself into living beings, does it not? It is precisely in attributing a will and direction to evolution where he breaks from scientific orthodoxy, and precisely here where he proposes his most compelling idea. He sees the force we call evolution and believe it to be dead, deterministic, and random as a pre-existent, as eternal, as a numinous something whose operation is designed to bring itself to birth. It is the potentiality of the mystics which actualizes itself. The spirit that becomes matter, the incarnation. In the biblical sense, it is the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. The divine Son, which is identical to its Father. It is that which brings itself into being. And critically, this very actualizing, this change of state, as he would say, is a function of evolution. It is self-diversification, the one becoming many. But this is only half of the Ouroboros. The many must also become one. In the explosion of the Big Bang, Chardin sees, quote, a unity of dispersed impetus and dispersed consciousness. He sees a will and a spirit diffused in primordial multiplicity, and a force from within acting upon them. First gravity, then chemical bonds, and eventually sexual union and social cohesion, bringing them all gradually back into union. Remember, Chardin said, quote, this perpetual opposition between the one born of the many and the many constantly being born of the one runs right through evolution. The process does have a culmination. It is aiming at something. And that something he calls omega. It is the next stage of evolution, which branches off from the pinnacle so far reached, human consciousness. He observes yet another face of the unifying force of nature acting uniquely upon it. Love. And as love brings our hearts and minds ever closer together, he predicts a final change of state, a capstone of the evolutionary process. All dispersed wills brought into harmony and manifesting the ultimate incarnation, the one, God, the thing which was driving the process of creation from the very beginning. And the end of that process, the end of the world, from a religious perspective, is, of course, the beginning of another. Yet another example of the fractal expansion of the soul of nature. That thing we observe and call evolution. An endless cycle of being and becoming, of the actualizing of potential.
Well, there you have it. That's one avenue explored, but infinitely more still to go. I hope you enjoyed thinking along with us. I know. It's not easy work. Thinking. It's hard and full of uncertainties, but I'm grateful for the company as we trek through this together. Here's to hoping that the juice is worth the squeeze. See what I did there? Let's find out together in the next episode.